All right, so now that we have some surface detail on here, let's talk about our new section here, which is specular shading. So specular shading is the next step in our journey to making realistic art and just kind of expanding our artistic tool set. There are a lot of different forms of specular shading, and there's a lot of aspects to it we'll explore as we progress. But specular shading, at the end of the day, is what we could consider a direct reflection of light. So it is what we consider a highlight. Now, some things that are important is right now we kind of just see a generic representation of specularity, but specularity is actually light dependent. So if we were to add a light to the scene, you would see that the specular light would be trying to directly reflect that. However, reflectance also have to deal with the position of the viewer. So the highlight's going to be biased towards us, but guided by the light. So let's take a look at that real quick and start by creating a directional light. So let's go ahead and go to create lights, directional light. That's going to add our directional light to the scene. And remember to turn those lights on. We can either hit the 7 key or we can hit the light bulb up here. So let's go ahead and hit that 7 key so we can see this. And you will see our light here. So I'm going to go ahead and just position this. But you can see as I move the light, the specular highlight moves. So I'm not moving the highlight. The highlight is being moved because of the light. However, notice that my position to the light is also going to move the specular highlight. But notice that it's not going into the shadow region. So where the light doesn't hit, it can't reflect. Okay? So just be aware that these highlights are going to be dependent on light itself. So it's not bad to have a light in your scene when you're setting these up and editing them. So let's go ahead and take a look at the properties here. Notice when I added in that light, it came into my node graph. You can just move that off to the side. If you want to clear it out, you could also just select your ball again here, remap your inputs and outputs, and there you go. It's not going to be bugging you anymore. So let's go ahead and take a look at the different categories here for specularity. The first thing is going to be specular color, and the specular color is going to control two aspects. It's going to control the color of the reflection, and it's going to control a certain aspect of the intensity. So what do I mean by that? The value of the color is linked into the intensity. For example, if I drag this downwards to black, you will see that this is no longer a specular object. So if you have black, what happens is you actually have no reflection at all. Now, why is this important? This means that we can turn off the reflectivity using things like textures. And we can make certain areas more reflective and certain areas less reflective, which is really neat. If I go ahead and increase it, you can see the reflection gets even brighter. So we can actually make areas brighter or darker using this. You can also change the color of the reflection by coming in here and selecting a color, and you will see that the color and intensity change the color of the reflected light. Something to be aware of is colored reflections are not common. This is a very stylized thing, and it's also how to describe metals. So metallic surfaces will often have a color similar to the base color of the metal as the reflection. And you can see as I push this towards a golden color, it actually makes those stars look a bit metallic. But if I were to switch this and push this more towards a blue color, you would see that it would make the blue ball appear more metallic. Generally speaking, unless you're doing some sort of a special effect, you want to make sure your specular color is white or working within the grayscale spectrum. Now, the next few dials are going to vary based on what kind of shader you're using. I'm using a Blinn shader because it's one of the more basic shaders that you see used. There's other shaders such as Fongs and anisotropic shaders that you might end up using. And as we progress further, you get into render-specific shaders like the standard surface shader that have even different properties, but they work on sort of the same premise. So eccentricity here is going to be what controls glossiness. Glossiness is whether or not the surface is smooth and reflective, like what we see here. You can see it almost looks wet, or if it's rough and diffuse, meaning spread out. So between specular color and eccentricity, we can make the surface look like just about anything. If I wanted to make this look like a rubber ball, then the default setup would be pretty useful with a low eccentricity, so it has a bit of gloss, and a high shininess. But if I wanted this ball to maybe look like it was a bath bomb or maybe a piece of chalk, I could come with a high eccentricity, which gives me this nice spread out highlight, and a low specular color. So I get a low reflection light that's spread across the surface, representing something that's rough. So that's eccentricity. Specular roll-off is another master dial for intensity. So kind of like we have this diffuse dial here, which controls the brightness of the color. That's set to 0.8 by default. We could use the specular roll-off to do the same, to push this to be brighter, or we can push it to be darker. Now, reflectivity, we're not going to get to. Reflectivity deals with the actual renderer using a ray trace renderer like Arnold. So we're not going to touch that, but reflectivity in many ways is just consequence of specular reflection. So we're going to leave that alone, and we're going to ignore that and just take a look at specular color and eccentricity for now. So let's go ahead and give ourselves a scenario here that might be interesting. Let's make the ball shinier on the star and stripe areas and less shiny on the ball itself. So let's create a specular map that allows us to drive that, where we're going to have a brighter highlight on the stars and a not so bright highlight on the blue ball. The way we can do that is hop over here, and as you might have guessed, we can just save out a file. I'm going to start with my bump here. We're going to do a save as, and I'm going to go ahead and save this as ball, specular color, or just specular. Save. And I'm going to toggle some visibilities here. I might want to keep this roughness for later here, and I might want to go ahead and name that. So I might want to name it something like difference clouds, since that's what it is. I'll just double click here, go ahead and name that difference clouds, and just toggle the visibility. But on these, I'm going to go ahead and change the color a bit. So I already have the background as gray. Maybe we'll start with that. But coming into the shapes here, I'll go ahead and change the fill. Now, I might change the stroke too. I'm going to change the stroke to pure white, so that way the ledges are extra shiny. And I'm going to take the fill, and I'll go ahead and bump the fill to be around 80. So a little bit less shiny than the bump edges. That way those maybe catch a little bit more light, look even shinier. And we could reverse those if we wanted to as well. We could make the interior the brighter one and the outside the darker one. Just depends on our preferences. But something like that will result in some variation. So let's go ahead and save and just see what it gives us. We may or may not like it. We can always come back and change it. And just like I did with the previous maps, I'm going to come into the file input here. We're going to go ahead and click on that, and we're going to input our specular. So let's go ahead and link that in. We already have it set to search for file, which is great. We can just grab that file there and plug this in. So let's go ahead and click that. From there, you can click the file icon, and we can go ahead and select our ball folder and our ball specular and hit open. And if you take a look at that now, you can see how those ledges on those stars are really catching, and the ball, not so much. We're not getting quite as much intensity there. Now, I might want to bring up the ball a little bit, and I might even bring the interior of the stars up a bit, but you can see how that gives us a very unique look to the ledge there and gives us some surface variation for that specular highlight. So adjust yours as needed. I'm going to come in here and maybe bump this up to be just behind the other ones. We'll go ahead and set this to maybe 70. So that's going to give us quite a bit of difference between the stars, but not so much of a difference between the midsection of the stars, because I have those at 80. And you'll see that will just bump that middle highlight up a bit. So that's going to be specular color, and it is going to control the specular channel. Now, for full control of this, we also need to explore how to control the eccentricity, which we'll go ahead and take a look at next. But before we explore the eccentricity as a challenge, what I want you to do is go ahead and set up a specular color for your ball and see if you can add some variation to the surface, making some areas more shiny than others, before we go ahead and take a look at how we can use eccentricity to control the gloss. All right, so let's go ahead and explore eccentricity now. So as we looked at, eccentricity is going to be what's going to control the glossiness here and the diffuseness of the surface. There's some unique aspects about eccentricity though. Notice it is the first category we're dealing with here that doesn't necessarily have a color swatch in front. So eccentricity is unique because it is a single channel of information. That means it's not like specular color or color that uses the red, green, and blue inputs, all three. It uses a single input that is black and white information. So when it comes to eccentricity, you can only have black and you can only have white. Now, one of those is going to be super glossy and one of those is going to be super shiny. If you don't know which is which, a great way to start is by just creating some extremes. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as, and we're going to go ahead and save this as our eccentricity or gloss map. I'm going to use gloss since it's the common term, since eccentricity is exclusive to Blinn, but the idea of glossiness is actually used by a lot of different materials and different applications. Now, to push ourselves to the extreme, let's go ahead and set our background color to be pure white. And we'll come into the individual channels here. I'm going to turn off the stroke, and I'm going to go ahead and just make the surfaces pure black. This way, we can explore the extremes and we can figure out how the system works. Anytime you're approaching something that you don't understand fully, this is a good way to start off your approach. That way you can understand how it works. Now, why am I saying this? Gloss is notorious for being flip-flopped. Sometimes black is going to be your glossy and white's going to be your diffuse. Sometimes white's going to be your glossy and black's going to be your diffuse. And it can actually differ within the same application. So just be aware of that. It's inconvenient, but it's the first test that you want to do when working in software. Coming into here, let's look at how this differs from other connections. It's going to start the same way. We're going to link in the eccentricity here using the file input. We're going to click on file here, and we're going to link in our color. So I can just come to the file here, all eccentricity, or in this case, gloss, and hit open. But you're going to notice it doesn't quite have the effect we're looking for. Or it does. It's hard to say. Yeah, I guess that kind of works for low prediction. It's not exactly what we might expect. But what I want to show you is why it might not be giving the results we expect here. And that has to do with the nodes. Exploring the nodes here, let me go ahead and just organize them a little bit so it's not a crazy spaghetti monster here. And let's make this a bit bigger so we can zoom in and I can show you some of the concepts here. So if you take a look at the nodes themselves, you can actually see what is connecting to where. So let's start with the color up here. You can see that we have this out color and it's connecting to color. And if we take a look at specular color, you'll see that we have our out color here connecting to our specular color. But when we come into our eccentricity, you'll notice that one of these is not like the other because this one is linking in the out alpha to the eccentricity dial. Now, why is that? Well, you'll notice that each of these have a plus icon next to them. And that's because these are what we call a 3-channel output and a 3-channel input. In short, this has 3 channels to plug into here. You can think of this a bit like power outlets. Sometimes you'll have a power outlet with 3 prongs that has a grounding switch and requires you to go into a 3-pronged outlet that also has a grounding switch. So 3 can go into 3. And sometimes you'll have a power outlet that just has 2. You can actually think of this a bit as being the same. If you have one of these outputs with 3, it can plug into an output with 3, no problem, just like our 3-pronged power cord. But if you have an output with 3, you can't exactly plug it into an output with 1. You need to find a way to convert that or to modify it. So there's a few different ways we can do this. The simplest way is to change how the file is read by giving it an alpha channel. Right now, we technically don't have an out alpha. And if you click onto the file that you need to change, at the bottom, you can see there's this checkbox called alpha is luminance. What that will do is it will use the luminance of an image as the out alpha. Now, an image's luminance is what the image looks like if it's just complete grayscale. So this will convert our image from 3 channels to 1, essentially, so we don't have to do any fancy conversions to get this hooked up. And this is important whenever you're dealing with a single channel output like what we have here going to eccentricity. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. I'm going to click alpha is luminance. And if I go ahead and update this, we're probably not going to see much of a change, but that's going to be how we can get that properly hooked up. Now, why aren't we seeing a change? The reason why is because we're using the extremes, hyper glossy and hyper diffuse. Fortunately, we can tell from this that the blue is the diffuse color or the spread out color, and the stars are not. So white is going to be considered diffuse in this setup, and black is going to be considered glossy. This is a pretty common approach. Now, what that means is as we get closer to black, it's going to be shinier, and as we get closer to white, it's going to be less shiny. So just to give us a base to work from, I'm going to go ahead and set the background here to 50% on the ball, 50% gray. We're going to hit OK, and we'll go ahead and update this to see how this looks with that at 50. And you'll see with 50, that now has a decent shine. From there, if I wanted to make the stars a little bit more glossy, maybe I could try something like 30. And you'll find that these values need to be very close together. So we'll make those 30 gray, and I'll do the same with the stripe. We'll go ahead and make that 30 gray. That way, these will be a little bit more glossy than the ball is. If we go ahead and double click that, we can see now that that highlight is broader on the ball than it is on the stars. It's a little bit more concentrated. You can see how shape is there. I think this is probably the best angle to see it from. So taking a look at the shape, you can see it's this large on the ball and it's this large on the stripe. So this is going to be what we consider diffuse or more spread out. And this is going to be considered more concentrated or glossy. So that's what's going on here. We have that spread out, we have that concentrated. Now we can throw a wrench in the operation altogether by breaking up the surface even more, by maybe making the star edges a little bit glossier even. We could come in here and rather than having these set to 30, we could set these to 20. And we could do the same thing here. Now notice I like to do steps of 10. That's just a personal preference. I feel like it gets you from being a little bit too, did that do something, to, hey, that actually did something. So I like to do values of 10 when I'm doing an initial sort of block in and adjustment. If we go ahead and double click this now, you'll see that those are even glossier around the ledges, and we get even more breakup to that form. Now you can also add a lot of variety by just bringing in something like a difference clouds here. This is going to cause complete chaos here, but just to show you, we could introduce this, and now you'll see that we have surface breakup of glossiness where some areas are more glossy or less glossy than others. Now, I do like to have a little bit of that, but this is a little bit too intense. So I might tone it back using something like opacity, but you can see how we get a lot of variation across the surface here, which can indicate different levels of wear and different levels of damage. So with this, I'm going to use the opacity of the layer, which is located over here, to just make it very subtle. Subtle, for those of you who are not familiar, means hardly noticeable. We use that term a lot in texturing. So we'll just go ahead and set this to maybe 10%, just to have a little bit of surface breakup. You're probably not going to notice it, but it's one of those things where it's like, hey, I know it's there, and that's all that matters. So there we go. But that's going to give us some control over that eccentricity. From here, we can use the specular roll-off as sort of a master dial to control it. We're not going to drive that with any maps. But that's going to give us a complete texture set for our object. So at this stage, we're going to have color, which is going to control the outward color. We're going to have a bump, which is controlling the surface detail and making it feel indented or elevated, adding in some extra detail like our ledges to our stars and our ball stripe. We're going to have a specular color, which is going to control which areas are really reflecting light, which ones are the brightest and which ones are darker. And we also have our gloss, which is going to affect which areas appear rougher than others, which ones are more shiny and which ones are more diffuse. So as a challenge, what I want you to do is I want you to try creating an eccentricity map of your own to control the glossiness of your ball. Remember that it is a single channel output using that alpha. So you're going to make sure alpha is luminance is on. It may or may not make a big difference. You'll notice now that I'm turning it off, you can see there is a pretty big difference now that my texture is not just black and white. So it does indeed do something. So go ahead and get that set up and get your ball up and running. Feel free to revisit some of the other textures as well if you would like to just add some variation. Some things you might want to try out is using some difference clouds to create some variation on the color map, or maybe using something like the specular. So I'm going to do that next, so feel free to pause and go ahead and adjust your glossiness, and then hit resume if you want to see how to go about adding some variation to the color and to the specular. Okay, so I'm going to need to open up my color and my specular if I want to edit them. I could actually go to File and Open to access my recent tabs here and just grab my ball specular. And inside of here, I had the difference clouds, didn't really use them, it looks like. Maybe I turned them off. But I do the same thing here, just set these to around 10%, maybe a little bit higher with this one, maybe something like 30. That way we get some variation. And this is going to act a bit like dirt. It's going to make it less shiny with the setup I have with this set to multiply. So if we come into Maya here and I double click this, you'll see that it's just going to give us areas that are less shiny than others. It's not really going to be that noticeable, so not the biggest deal. Let's go ahead and go to color here. And with color in particular, it's good to have color breakup. So that way it's not uniform, meaning it doesn't look the same everywhere. So I can set up my difference clouds the same way. I can create a fresh layer here. And now that black's in my background, I'm going to hit Control Backspace. And we can go ahead and do a filter. We can do a render and difference clouds. Now for this one, I need to decide how I want this to go, what I want this to be. I mainly just want this to kind of break up the surface of the ball a little bit so that it's not all a perfectly flat color. A way we can achieve that by adding lightness and darkness to it is by using a blending mode of an overlay. And this will add some light areas and some dark areas to our ball. Now I'm going to save. This is going to look horrendous, but it will be noticeable. And you can see the difference that makes inside of here. Now there's some areas I don't really like this top area where it's all converging, but it does add in that breakup. Now this is where that word subtle comes in that I'm talking about. We want a lot of these details to be subtle, so I'm going to set this down to about 10%. That way I know it's there, and you can actually see the light and dark splotches, but it's not going to be that noticeable inside of 3D. And a lot of the times low opacity is going to be the secret for that. You can see it a little bit too clearly at the top there. So I might take this even lower, down to something like 2%, and that way I just have some breakup there, but it's not terribly noticeable. So I think that'll give us an okay look for what I'm aiming for. All right, so feel free to add some variation. Like I mentioned, use the expanse of your knowledge. So if you are already a Photoshop expert, have a blast with this. Take the knowledge, see how far you can push it, and we'll be exploring this more in depth as we move forward. So this is a very base look at the different channels we can control. We're going to do a deep dive into this later on. This is just to kind of get us introduced and to make this project look a little bit more interesting. So let's go ahead and stop here, and we'll move on to the next topic.